This is part 8, and the third part of part 8, if that makes any sense. Let's see, I'm just going to hop right in. At this stage, with greater involution of consciousness, subtle conscious God in the man state on the second plane gains greater awareness of the infinite energy of the subtle plane and is now capable of performing tricks or minor miracles of lower degree through the release of his infinite energy, and can demonstrate such powers as converting a dry tree into a green one and vice versa, stopping railroad trains and motor cars, filling a dry well with water, and so forth. This subtle conscious God in the man state on the second plane experiences the subtle world with the subtle senses of his subtle body. He is now totally not conscious of the gross world, though from all outward appearances he remains and functions as an ordinary man, eating, sleeping, having feelings of pain and pleasure, and so forth. Yet actually, his involved consciousness experiences not the gross but the subtle sphere, and creates fresh subtle impressions through his subtle senses, which are 3 in number, with faculties only of seeing, smelling, and hearing. Further involution of consciousness makes it possible for God in the man state to experience the third plane of the subtle world. Here, subtle consciousness gains greater awareness of the infinite energy of the subtle sphere, and God in the man state experiences greater infinite power. In this stage, he is capable of performing grand miracles such as giving sight to the blind, restoring limbs to the maimed, and sometimes even raising the dead into life. In this state, subtle conscious God in the man state is also capable of experiencing the different planes and worlds of the subtle sphere, just as the gross conscious human form is capable of traveling from one continent to another, using the gross vehicles at his disposal. The second and third planes of the subtle world are the 2 major planes which are solely in the domain of the subtle world. The first plane is partially in the domain of the subtle world and partially of the gross world. Similarly, the fourth plane is partially of the subtle world and partially of the mental world. For this reason, the fourth plane is said to be the threshold of the mental world. Now, with gradual, though progressive gain in the involution of the consciousness of subtle conscious God in the man state, the consciousness of God experiences the fourth plane of the subtle cum mental. In the fourth plane, God in the man state is fully conscious of the subtle body and completely experiences the subtle sphere, and therefore he is completely aware of the subtle nature of the subtle sphere, which is infinite energy. This is the very same infinite energy which is the finite aspect in the nothingness of that infinite and unbounded power of God, which was latent in God's state of the everything. In the fourth plane, God in the man state is fully equipped with infinite energy, and thus he is now capable of raising the dead and even creating new forms in new worlds, breathing with life. Subtle conscious God in the man state in the fourth plane is in reality infinite energy personified. The infinite energy of the fourth plane of the subtle cum mental worlds is not the ordinary so-called energy of the gross world. It is that infinite energy which is called the breath of all life, or pran, and which can cause all things to become alive. It is this energy which, when infinite, can create living things out of dust. Although this energy be infinite, it is yet by no means equivalent to the reality of that infinite power of God. The infinite power of God, when translated into illusion, becomes the finite aspect of the infinite energy of the fourth plane of the subtle cum mental worlds. Subtle conscious God in man state, possessing the key to the store of the infinite energy of the fourth plane, is now firmly established of the infinite energy of the fourth plane, is now firmly established on the threshold of the mental world, and is confronted by the full blast of the intense desires, emotions, and thoughts, which are aspects of mind of the mental world. Though the fourth plane is the exalted stage of consciousness where God in the man state consciously experiences himself as infinite energy personified, yet it is the state of experiences of the so-called darkest night, because here the consciousness of God in the man state undergoes the experience of being caught, as it were, between the devil and the deep, fired by intense desires and emotions, the overpowering incitement or temptation to wield and use this infinite energy, which is at his command, proves a treacherous foe at this juncture, when the involution of consciousness of subtle conscious God in the man state is unfailingly and rapidly progressing towards the mental sphere, where it will gain mastery of all desires, emotions, and thoughts. Cheers, welcome in, how's it going? If desires at their zenith emanated by the mental plane, confronting the consciousness of God in the man state in the fourth plane, overpower God in the man state on the fourth plane, and if the forces generated by the infinite energy at his command are released by him, then the experience of the liberation of infinite energy at this juncture often proves fatal, especially when he grossly misuses the forces liberated by infinite energy to satisfy selfish ends indiscriminately. At this juncture on the fourth plane, if the power of the infinite energy of the subtle world is indiscriminately liberated, the resultant effect of the complete liberation of that energy is almost unimaginable by gross consciousness. However, an idea could be gathered of the results from the fantastic experiences of the liberation of nuclear energy, which is merely one of the gross aspects of the infinite energy of the subtle world. Thus, the involved consciousness of God in the man state succumbs to the temptation of experiencing the complete liberation of infinite energy in the fourth plane of consciousness. The inevitable experience is so severe that the full consciousness gained and the subtle consciousness experienced totally disintegrate into the most finite consciousness, identifying God once again with the most finite gross forms of stone. Consequently, the consciousness of stone conscious God must once again go through the entire process of the evolution of consciousness, identifying himself with gross forms until he identifies with man and gains and again wins full consciousness. They've really driven that point home quite a bit. It is a fact that when consciousness is once gained, it can never be lost. But the disintegration of consciousness from the fourth plane is the one exception to the rule. The disintegration of consciousness occurs only in the case of the fourth plane consciousness, and that, too, only very, very rarely when he succumbs to the temptation of misusing the powers of that plane. If God in the man state in the fourth plane does not misuse the powers of infinite energy, but uses them discriminately without being overpowered by desires, then with further involution of consciousness, the subtle conscious God in the man state experiences directly the sixth plane of the mental world, skipping over the experiences of the fifth plane of the mental world. Straight up chutes and ladders up here in the spiritual world. There is a asterisk by desires, so I'll read that. A footnote. Desires must be consciously wiped out because they can create new impressions and in turn further desires which may lead to further binding actions. Consciousness is preoccupied with such impressions and their physical expression rather than with the real self. If these impressions are wiped away consciously, the soul, Atma, will then begin to perceive the truth and will begin to emancipate itself from the tyranny of worldly desires. The individual, Jiv Atma, minus life of desires, becomes soul, Atma, and is always the unconscious Almighty. It is while we are living that life must be given up, to renounce worldly desires while retaining consciousness of unconsciousness is the goal of life. Wow, we just accidentally figured out the meaning of life real quick. What up, Helaby? Sounds a lot like Buddhism, wouldn't you agree? But if God in the man state in the fourth plane neither uses or abuses the power of infinite energy, then gradually, with further involution of consciousness, subtle conscious God in the man state in the fourth plane of consciousness crosses the threshold of the mental world and begins to experience the fifth plane of consciousness. And if you're wondering, when it says God in the man state, that means you. The fifth and sixth planes of consciousness are fundamentally the planes of the mental sphere of the mind. In the mental world, mental conscious God in the man's state is master of his mind, whereas in the gross and subtle worlds, when gross and subtle consciousness, he was the slave of his mind. So that's kind of where we're at. And then once we involve our consciousness further, we become conscious of the subtle, energetic world. And when we do that, we're no longer conscious of the physical world. And that's when we have infinite power over energy. And if we misuse it, we start the whole process of evolution of consciousness back at the beginning. So that's just my personal recap. Back to it. With the progress of the involution of consciousness, of subtle conscious God in the man state, the experiences of the fifth plane of the mental world are realized by the mental sense, which is only that of seeing. So we have the gross world where we eat and sleep and poop and all that. And then we have the energetic world where there's only three things. I think it's seeing, hearing, and one other, I can't remember. So now in the mental world, we can only see. And in the next one up is God realized, where you realize the self, and that's where you just have, that's when you're done. In the man state, when God is mental conscious, he is not conscious of the gross or subtle bodies, but he does work through the gross and subtle bodies, not directly, but on them, on and from the mental plane. So even if mental conscious God in the man state is not conscious of the gross and subtle bodies, and therefore does not realize the experiences of the gross and subtle worlds, he still can unconsciously utilize the gross body through various aspects of the gross. It's kind of like your higher self. That's what it seems like to me. The way the way we talk to angels or our higher self, that's kind of like us, but like from the higher self perspective is what this is describing, I think. He is thus observed eating, drinking, sleeping, seeing, hearing, and feeling as in an ordinary gross conscious human form, although he is all the while conscious only of the mental and body with his mental sense of only seeing. Similarly, he can unconsciously utilize his subtle body through various aspects of infinite energy, and is thus observed moving about actively and performing acts, while all the time he is only conscious of the mental body, the mind, and only consciously experiences the mental world with his mental sense. Mental conscious God in the man state in the mental sphere has now only one sense, and that is of seeing. The mind persists through the fifth plane of consciousness. In the sixth plane of consciousness, the mind itself becomes the inner eye and sees God. In the seventh plane of consciousness, the mind is annihilated. Hence, it is that mental conscious God in the man state in the fifth plane experiences the impressions generated through his mental sense of seeing, and consequently experiences the mental world with the mental body, mind. He is now conscious only of mind. In this stage, God in the man state is capable of controlling the minds of gross conscious and subtle conscious states of God in subtle conscious and gross conscious human forms. But in the fifth plane, mental conscious God in the man state is totally incapable of performing any miracles because he is now in the mental sphere and no longer in the subtle sphere of infinite energy, which when released resulted in miraculous powers. Yet, because he is mental conscious and is about to become mind personified, he controls the mind of the subtle conscious state of God and becomes the source which incites those in the state of subtle consciousness to perform miracles. He is the one who, in the mental conscious state, according to the desire and will of his mind, is capable of checking, controlling, or guiding the minds of those in the subtle conscious planes, either to perform miracles or not, though he himself, in his mental conscious state, cannot perform any miracle. Quite repetitive, but definitely driving the point in. God, in the man state of mental consciousness, is capable of creating and controlling the thoughts, desires, and emotions of all minds in gross and subtle conscious states. He is himself stable as soon as he experiences the state of the fifth plane, from which state the consciousness involved thus far can never devolve nor disintegrate. As the involution of consciousness of mental conscious God in the man state gradually progresses deeper and deeper, he experiences his mastery over the mind, and the consciousness of mental conscious God is said to be mind personified. Thus, God in the man state now becomes fully conscious of the mind or the mental body and experiences the whole of the mental sphere or the mental world in the sixth plane of the mental consciousness. This experience is of seeing God in its original state face to face. This seeing is the seeing of the mental consciousness with the mental sense of seeing. In other words, God in the man state sees everywhere and in everything. Right from the first plane up through the sixth plane, the involution of consciousness progressed gradually and consistently as the consciousness of God underwent fewer and scarcer experiences of multifarious and diverse opposite impressions, which grew fainter and fainter. Therefore, during the progress of the involution of consciousness of God, the diverse opposite impressions gradually lessened and became fainter until the involved consciousness of God in the sixth plane was fully conscious of the mental body and experienced the mental world in full with practically no impressions at all except for a last faint trace of residual impressions of opposites. In other words, the involved consciousness fully identifies with the mind, and God tends to realize that he is the mind. Now, God, in the man state as mind, has the last finite impression that he is mind, sees God face to face in all things except in his self. This is the state of God in the man state in the sixth plane of consciousness. The mental conscious God in the man state of the sixth plane, practically void of all impressions at this point and only conscious of his mind, is now confronted by God himself and sees him face to face and also sees him in all things. But he does not see his self in God because he is still impressed with the consciousness of the mind and takes himself as mind. This mental conscious God in the man state associating himself with mind is conscious of himself as mind and experiences himself as still something other than God because he actually sees God face to face with his mental consciousness. Then, too, he sees God much more vividly and intensely than in the gross or subtle states of God. He can see the gross and subtle objects in the gross and subtle worlds. In this stage of consciousness of God, which had experienced diverse and innumerable opposite impressions, now experiences the last trace of dual impressions of opposites. Therefore, mental conscious God in the man state on the sixth plane is yet conscious of duality. That is, identifies himself as mind and differentiates himself from God. In order to understand the involution of consciousness in the mental sphere more clearly, it is necessary to understand the mental sphere of the fifth and sixth planes of consciousness is the domain of the mind. The mind of the mental plane has two sections. In the first section, the state of mind is inquiring and reflecting. In this state, the mind functions as thoughts, high thoughts, low thoughts, good thoughts, bad thoughts, material thoughts, spiritual thoughts, and thoughts of every kind, type, and state. In the second section, the state of mind is impressive or sympathetic. In this state, mind functions as feelings of sufferings and emotions, feelings of desires and longings, feelings of pains of separation, and feelings of every kind and type and state. Since mind of the mental sphere has distinct dual functions, it is inevitable that the experiences in the field of mind, i.e. the mental sphere, must be distinctively of two kinds also. Thus, the mental sphere has two domains. Therefore, the domain on the fifth plane of consciousness is of thoughts, and the domain of the sixth plane of consciousness is feelings. Consequently, the consciousness of mental conscious God in the man state in the fifth plane identifies with the first section of mind, which is inquiring or reflecting mind. Therefore, this mental conscious God in the man state of the fifth plane is the creator and master of thoughts, as he is thoughts personified, and is accordingly capable of controlling only the thought section of all mind, of all gross and subtle conscious states of God. This is often misinterpreted as controlling the minds of all gross and subtle conscious states of God, but the fact is that God in the fifth plane of consciousness does not control the mind as a whole, but controls only that state of mind which functions as thoughts. Mental conscious God in the man state in the fifth plane of consciousness, while identifying himself as inquiring or reflecting mind emanating only thoughts, does not identify himself with the second section of mind, and is therefore still capable of establishing mastery over feelings, i.e. emotions and desires. With greater involution of consciousness, mental conscious God in the man state of the fifth plane progresses into the sixth plane of consciousness, wherein he gains consciousness of the second section of mind of the mental sphere, and thus tends to identify himself with that second section of mind, i.e. impressive or sympathetic mind. Mental conscious God in the man state in the sixth plane of consciousness experiences the mental world with the mental sense of seeing, though completely identification with feelings. And thus God in the man state is not thoughts, but is feelings personified. Wherefore, he experiences consciously the feelings of seeing God face to face continuously in all things and everywhere. He feels seeing God everywhere continuously, but he cannot feel seeing himself in God. For this reason, he cannot reconcile feelings of sight of God with his own identity as God, because he still identifies himself with feelings. He feels for, longs for, and pangs for union with God, whom he at this stage feels seeing face to face. Thank you for the likes. What's up? Jesus. The identification with the second section of mind, feelings, is the state of God in the man state where the predominant aspect of divine love, which eventually leads to union with God, i.e. realization of the God state consciously, is manifested most forcefully. Hence, it should be clear that the fifth plane of the mental sphere is the state of full consciousness of thoughts only. The mastery over control and creation of thoughts alone is established, and there is no mastery of control over feelings or of desires and emotions. But the sixth plane of the mental sphere is the state of full consciousness of feelings, and thus the mastery over control and creation of feelings is established, and no more scope is now left for even a single thought to penetrate into the domain of feelings. The sixth plane consciousness is thoughtless and governs the feelings of all the gross and subtle conscious states of God. This is often misinterpreted as mastery over the hearts of all in the gross and subtle conscious states of God. He does not govern or regulate the so-called hearts, but controls and governs that second section of mind in the mental sphere which emanates feelings of emotions and desires. The loving of God and the longing for his union is really and fully demonstrated in the sixth plane of consciousness. Only when the sixth plane of the mental sphere is transcended does illusion vanish with the vanishing of the last trace of impressions, and reality is realized. Mental conscious God in the man state on the sixth plane is still experiencing duality, because God in this state of consciousness finds himself as mind and not as God. This experience of duality lingers on and on until the final involution of consciousness attains the seventh plane of consciousness. This is the final and seventh stage in the process of involution of consciousness, when the full consciousness of God in the man state is now fully withdrawn inwards, so completely that it is now fixed and focused onto himself rather than onto the objects of his own creation. Now that full consciousness has been fully involved, the objects of nothingness which apparently appeared to exist vanish completely, together with their impressions. With complete annihilation of impressions of the associations of the nothing, the impressioned consciousness of God in the man state is spontaneously transformed into the unimpressioned or impressionless consciousness of God, which makes God in the man state experience the passing away in his original state of absolute vacuum. It is but natural that the full consciousness, fully involved, and now free from even the slightest trace of any impression, should give no other experience but that of the original absolute vacuum of state of God, which once prevailed and which is now experienced consciously. So yeah, the entire process of evolution and involution of consciousness, the only difference is you're in a state of God unconsciously, and then you're in a state of God consciously. That's what I'm gathering. This full consciousness, fully involved, is the super consciousness, or the Mahaschaitanya. Can't say that right. The unconscious God is the original absolute vacuum state, is now fully conscious or super conscious of his original state of God in the beyond state. This passing away in the absolute vacuum of the original state of God is called attaining the fana of the seventh plane of consciousness. In Sufi terms, fana means passing away in. Fana, F-A-N-A, has two stages. The first stage of fana is the conscious experience of the absolute vacuum state, and the second stage of fana, or fana phila, is the conscious experience of the I am God state. Fana phila, the second stage, is the goal of God in the man state, where God in human form, that is, as a man, ultimately realizes the I am God state with full consciousness. This is the state of final majzubiyat, as it is termed by the Sufis. Thanks for the comment. Thanks for the follow. Thanks for the hugs. It's getting deep at this point. We're all the way to the end of the journey of involution of consciousness, much before the first stage. How did you pop up here? Did I do that?
I don't know. I have no idea. This is the first time I've
Well,
ever done this
I'm gonna
before.
kick you out if I figure